Welcome to Top 10 Secret, where the creepiest mysteries are unveiled. Have you ever heard of the chained spirit? A tormented soul unable to move on, forever trapped between the world of the living and the afterlife? This is just one of the many terrifying stories waiting for you to uncover. Brace yourself. Once you step into Top 10 Secret, there's no turning back. Story 1. The Curse of the Chained Soul. Long ago, when the world was still shrouded in the darkness of malevolent forces, there was a small village deep within a cursed forest. The villagers whispered about a terrifying entity, a vengeful specter that could never find peace. They called it the Chained Soul. It is said that hundreds of years ago, a dark sorcerer named Victor Blackwood was captured and executed by the villagers for his horrifying crimes. He was no ordinary man. He performed ghastly rituals, sacrificing human souls to trade power with infernal beings. The villagers decided to burn him alive in purifying flames. But before he was consumed, Victor cursed the entire village, damning the bloodline of those who condemned him. "You will never know peace. I will return," he screamed in agony. When the fire finally died down, his body had vanished, leaving only rusted chains and the stench of charred flesh. Thus, the curse began. In the years that followed, the village knew no peace. Each full moon, they would hear the dragging of heavy chains across the ground, accompanied by a raspy, inhuman laughter that echoed from the depths of the forest. Children disappeared without a trace. Livestock was found mutilated beyond recognition. The villagers lived in constant terror, never daring to step outside after nightfall. Those who ventured into the forest were never seen again. The few who returned spoke of a towering, gaunt figure with rotting flesh clinging to an exposed skeleton. Its hollow eyes glowed a deep crimson, and its elongated claw-like fingers dragged behind chains that seemed impossibly heavy. Every step it took plunged the surroundings into a nightmarish haze. It is searching for a new sacrifice. The rumors spread like wildfire. A group of young villagers decided to uncover the truth. Among them was David Carter, a skeptical young man who refused to believe in ghost stories. They gathered one night under the full moon, armed with torches, protective charms, and knives for self-defense. But none of them realized they were walking into the very jaws of the chained soul's trap. One by one, they vanished into the darkness. One was dragged into the swamp, skeletal hands reaching from the murky depths, pulling him under. Another was strangled by chains that coiled around his throat, his eyes bulging in terror as his soul was wrenched from his body. Their screams of agony echoed throughout the forest. In the end, only David Carter remained. He found himself before an ancient well, where rusted chains wrapped tightly around a form that was no longer human. Darkness consumed him, a whisper slithering into his ear. "You are the last descendant. You are the key to my freedom." He ran, but it was futile. The next morning, the villagers found David lying lifeless in front of the church. His eyes were wide open, his body shriveled as if every ounce of life had been drained from him. The most terrifying part, the chains had disappeared. From that day on, the chained soul was never seen in the forest again. But every full moon, villagers would hear the soft clinking of chains dragging across the ground, accompanied by a raspy chuckle in the darkness. It was free. It was searching for a new place to spread its terror. And it could be right behind you. Story 2. The Curse of the Crawling Dead. Long ago, in the remote town of Black Hollow, a terrible curse took root, buried beneath layers of forgotten history. The land was once fertile, rich with crops and life, But over time, darkness crept in. The townspeople whispered of an ancient entity, an unspeakable horror that lurked beneath the soil, waiting for the right moment to rise again. They called it the crawling dead. Centuries ago, a woman named Eleanor Blackwood was accused of practicing forbidden magic. She was not just a mere healer or herbalist. According to the townsfolk, she dabbled in the blackest of arts, summoning spirits from beyond the grave. When children began disappearing and livestock were found mutilated, all fingers pointed at her. Without a trial, without mercy, they buried her alive in the cemetery, chaining her wrists and ankles, sealing her fate beneath the earth. But before they covered her completely, Eleanor spoke her final words. Her voice, raspy from the lack of air, sent shivers down their spines. "I will return, not in death, but in hunger. You will hear my breath in the wind, my nails clawing through the dirt, my whispers calling your name. And when I rise, you will crawl with me into the dark." The ground trembled as the last shovel of dirt was thrown over her face, but the townspeople ignored it. They turned their backs on the grave, thinking they had rid themselves of the evil that lurked among them. They were wrong. Years passed, and the town tried to forget the tale of Eleanor Blackwood. But the land never recovered. Crops withered, animals grew restless, and the nights became eerily silent. Then, the disappearances began. At first, it was the children. Young boys and girls would wander too close to the graveyard and never return. The search parties found nothing. No footprints, no drag marks, only deep, claw-like indentations in the soil. Then came the adults. One by one, they vanished in the dead of night, their beds left untouched, their doors still locked from the inside. Some claim to have seen figures crawling in the distance, silhouettes hunched over, moving unnaturally on all fours. Eyes glowed in the darkness like dying embers. The air carried a foul stench, a mix of rotting flesh and damp earth. Those who encountered these creatures never lived long enough to speak of what they truly saw. One stormy night, a group of travelers passing through Black Hollow took shelter in the abandoned chapel near the cemetery. They were a group of 5, young and fearless, laughing off the local legends. They built a fire, drank their whiskey, and ignored the howling wind outside. Then came the scratching. Soft at first, like the rustling of dry leaves. Then louder. Something was moving beneath the floorboards, scraping against the wood, trying to get in. One of the travelers, a man named Michael, dared to pry open a loose floorboard. A single rotting hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with an unnatural force. The flesh peeled away, revealing bony fingers tipped with claw-like nails. He screamed as the hand yanked him down, his body vanishing beneath the floor in an instant. The others stood frozen in terror as the floor split open and something began crawling out. Eleanor Blackwood had returned. Her eyes burned with an unnatural glow, her mouth twisted into a hideous grin of jagged teeth. Her hair, long and matted with dirt, clung to her skeletal face. But the worst part was her movements. She didn't walk, she crawled, her limbs jerking and snapping as if she had forgotten how to be human. One by one, the travelers tried to escape. One made it to the door, only to be dragged back by unseen hands beneath the ground. Another tried to run, but the shadows caught him, swallowing him whole. By dawn, the chapel was silent again, save for the faint sound of nails scratching at the walls from the inside. After that night, Black Hollow was never the same. The few remaining townspeople tried to flee, but the darkness had already taken root. The crawling dead emerged from the soil, their twisted bodies moving in unnatural ways, their whispers calling out to those who remained. They were not spirits, nor were they fully human. They were something in between, something worse. Eleanor led them, her hunger insatiable. She didn't just want revenge, she wanted company. She wanted the whole town to crawl with her into the abyss. and one by one, they did. When the last survivor, a boy named Samuel, tried to escape, he found the town gates had been sealed by an unseen force. The air smelled of decay. The ground pulsed beneath his feet. He turned, and there she was. Eleanor, grinning, her outstretched arms welcoming him into the darkness. He fell to his knees, screaming as the ground beneath him crumbled. By morning, Black Hollow was gone. Not abandoned, not destroyed, just gone. No trace of its people, no ruins, no remains. Only an empty field where the town once stood, with a single, unmarked grave in the center. And if you listen closely, on a quiet night, you might still hear it. The sound of nails scratching beneath the ground, waiting. Story 3: The Curse of the Whispering Shadow. Alex Turner had always been drawn to the unknown. A freelance photographer, he thrived on urban legends, abandoned places, and mysterious folklore. His latest commission came from an anonymous client, requesting photos of the infamous Whispering Tree, a gnarled oak deep in the Black Hollow woods. The legend was simple yet terrifying. Those who stood beneath its twisted branches at night would hear whispers calling their name. And those who answered were never seen again. The warnings didn't deter him. Equipped with his camera and flashlight, Alex ventured into the woods. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became, as if nature itself was holding its breath. By the time he reached the clearing, the sky was a deep, ominous shade of gray. The tree stood before him, ancient and malevolent, its skeletal branches clawing at the sky. A strange energy hung in the air, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. Raising his camera, he began to take pictures. The first few shots revealed nothing unusual, just a tree standing alone in a bed of mist. Then something changed. A figure materialized in the last frame. A woman in a flowing white gown, her hair draped over her face, her elongated fingers stretching toward him. Her eyes burned red, unnatural, filled with something ancient and hungry. A whisper curled around him like a breath of frost. Alex. He froze. The voice had not come from his mind, nor from the wind. It was close, too close. His hands trembled as he lowered the camera. The clearing was empty. The tree remained motionless. Yet the whisper came again, sliding over his skin like a phantom touch. Alex, you see me now. A shiver ran down his spine as something shifted behind him. His body screamed for him to run, but his feet refused to move. He turned slowly. The woman from the photograph stood mere feet away. Her tangled hair obscured her face, her body hovering just above the ground. The whispers grew louder, multiplying into an eerie chorus of voices from beyond. Alex stumbled backward, tripping over the exposed roots of the tree. The moment he hit the ground, the whispers stopped. Silence enveloped him. He scrambled to his feet, gasping for breath, but the woman was gone. Something had changed. The air grew heavier. The shadows lengthened unnaturally. A presence loomed over him. A hand, cold and skeletal, gripped his shoulder. A scream tore from his throat as unseen forces yanked him backward. The ground beneath him softened, turning to mud, pulling him in like quicksand. He clawed at the earth, his nails breaking as he struggled, but the shadows wrapped around him like tendrils, dragging him deeper into the abyss. Then, darkness. The next morning, the search team found Alex's abandoned camera near the tree. The images were still intact. Each one captured something more horrifying than the last. The final photo was the worst. It showed Alex, eyes wide in terror, half buried in the earth. His arms reached upward in a silent plea for help. Behind him stood the woman, her face finally visible. Her mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin, her teeth jagged and endless. Her hollow eyes seemed to bore through the screen, watching, waiting. Below the photo, scrawled in the dirt, was a message. "He is with us now." No trace of Alex Turner was ever found. But on quiet nights, if you dare to stand beneath the whispering tree, the voices will call for you too. And if you answer, you will never leave. Story 4. The Curse of Blackmore Castle. In the heart of the Blackmore Woods, a ruin looms under the eternal shroud of mist. It is a castle forgotten by time, abandoned yet never truly empty. The villagers call it Blackmore Castle, a name spoken only in whispers, for fear that something or someone might be listening. No one dares to approach it after dark. Centuries ago, the castle belonged to Count Aldrich Graves, a man of terrifying reputation. He was said to have dabbled in the dark arts, sacrificing the innocent in exchange for eternal life. On the night of a lunar eclipse, he conducted his final ritual, one that went horribly wrong. The sky turned crimson, the ground trembled, and a horrific wail echoed through the valley. The villagers who had gathered outside the castle to burn him alive witnessed something unspeakable. Aldrich was not dying. He was changing. No one knows exactly what he became, but they all heard the screams of those who remained inside. The next morning, the castle was silent. The great iron gates rusted shut overnight, and the stone walls seemed to weep with black ichor. But the curse did not stay locked inside. Legends of Blackmore Castle spread far and wide, drawing the curious and the foolish alike. The first few who dared to enter were never seen again. The bravest warriors, seasoned hunters, and even priests of the highest order attempted to dispel the evil lurking within, but none returned. One night, a group of villagers, armed with torches and silver weapons, ventured into the castle to end the curse once and for all. The next morning, their severed heads were found impaled on the castle's iron gates, their eyes wide open in horror. The bodies were never recovered. It was then the villagers knew the castle had awakened. The most horrifying event occurred years later on a night known as the Night of the Screaming Crows. A merchant caravan, unaware of the castle's reputation, set up camp nearby. That night, a deafening cacophony of crows surrounded the camp. The birds did not caw, but screamed like tortured souls. When dawn arrived, the camp was a slaughterhouse. Blood soaked the earth, wagons were torn apart, and the bodies of the merchants were nowhere to be found. The only clue left behind was a trail of deep claw marks leading toward the castle. From that night on, flocks of black crows circled the ruins, watching, waiting. The last known record of an attempt to explore the castle came from Daniel Whitmore, a scholar obsessed with proving supernatural myths false. He kept a journal detailing his journey inside Blackmore Castle. The following were the last entries found in his tattered notebook. "I have entered the castle. The air is thick, stagnant, carrying the stench of decay. The walls bleed darkness itself. There are voices here, whispers that echo from the stone, voices of the damned, voices that know my name. I feel them watching. The halls shift when I turn my back. Doors that were once open now lead to bricked walls. The paintings move when I'm not looking. I hear footsteps in the empty corridors. The crows outside have fallen silent. I found a great hall filled with withered bodies in tattered robes, their mouths stretched open in silent screams. Their hands reach for something unseen. And above them, carved into the stone, is a message written in a language I do not recognize. But I understand its meaning. He still reigns. I must leave. But the door is gone. The whispers are now voices. They beg me to stay. They tell me I am home. My reflection in the mirror is not my own. My shadow moves without me. There is something behind me. I will not turn around. That was the final entry. The journal was found outside the castle gates, drenched in fresh blood. There was no sign of Daniel Whitmore. Months passed, and the legend grew darker. A team of modern-day ghost hunters and researchers decided to investigate the ruins, bringing with them cameras, sensors, and tracking equipment. They went in during daylight, believing the stories to be exaggerated. They never came back. Days later, the villagers heard the screams, not just from the castle, but from the sky itself. Crows filled the air, circling in violent formations. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, they fell silent and scattered. The next morning, the castle gates stood open for the first time in centuries. Inside, the villagers found the ghost hunter's cameras still recording. The footage showed nothing at first, just static and shadows shifting unnaturally. But the last frame showed Count Aldrich Graves, not as a man, but as something monstrous. His eyes burned with infernal fire. His grin stretched far beyond human limits, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Behind him, the missing ghost hunters stood motionless, their eyes hollow, their mouths sewn shut with black thread. Then the screen flickered, and they all turned to look at the camera. The footage cut off there. The cameras were retrieved, but no one dared watch them again. The castle gate slammed shut the moment the last villager left, sealing its horrors once more. Now no one goes near Blackmore Castle. The crows still circle it, their numbers growing. Some say on nights when the moon is high, you can hear whispers from the castle walls calling out new names, calling for someone to join them. And if you are foolish enough to answer, you will never leave. Story 5. Demon of Ravenwood. Ravenwood was a small village, surrounded by ancient, eerie forests. The people here had lived in fear for centuries. They spoke of an ancient demon, a creature sealed in darkness, only emerging on full moon nights to hunt human souls. Stories were passed down of missing people, mutilated corpses, and terrifying howls echoing from the deep woods. James Miller, a young man from the city, did not believe in such legends. He was a journalist specializing in uncovering mysteries, and Ravenwood seemed like the perfect place for his next story. Ignoring the warnings from the villagers, James decided to venture into the forest on a full moon night to seek the truth. Darkness swallowed the forest as James stepped in. The silence was so profound that he could hear his own heartbeat. Every step he took crushed the dried leaves beneath him, producing small but haunting sounds in the night. A sudden gust of wind chilled his skin, carrying the stench of decaying flesh. Then he heard it. A raspy breath, heavy, prolonged, echoing as if it came from everywhere at once. James shone his flashlight around, but the weak beam couldn't pierce through the thick darkness. The feeling of being watched intensified. Something was there, a being that did not belong to this world. From the shadows, a pair of glowing red eyes appeared. A massive figure slowly emerged. Its skin was blackened, cracked, oozing blood, with twisted horns resembling dead tree branches. Its mouth gaped open, revealing sharp fangs dripping with a thick, dark substance. It roared. The sound was not from any ordinary creature. It echoed like hundreds of voices combined, like the wails of tormented souls. James felt his entire body freeze in horror. The beast lunged. Survival instinct kicked in, and James bolted. He didn't care about direction. He only knew he had to run. The demon's heavy footsteps thundered behind him, the ground trembling with each stride. Branches tore at his clothes, and the wind slashed his lungs like icy daggers. Then he tripped. James tumbled down a slope, crashing hard against a rock. Pain seared through his body, but there was no time to check his injuries. When he looked up, he saw an old, decayed structure, a long abandoned church. With no other choice, he rushed inside. The interior of the church was filled with shattered statues, blood-stained walls, and eerie silence. At the center of the main hall, a deep black pit radiated an icy chill. James realized this was no ordinary church. It was a seal, a gateway to hell. The demon roared from outside. It couldn't enter. James suddenly understood. The church was a prison for the demon, but the seal was weakening. Then he heard the whispers, hundreds of voices pleading for help, warning him to leave. But another voice, deeper, colder, whispered a horrifying truth. The demon is not the only predator here. A withered hand suddenly reached out from the darkness, gripping James by the throat. James struggled, but a shadowy figure emerged before him. A cursed spirit, a presence far more terrifying than the demon outside. It had once been a priest, the one who had summoned the demon, only to be devoured by his own creation. His soul had been trapped within the church, eternally tormented. "You will take my place and guard the seal," the voice rasped. Suddenly, chains erupted from the pit, wrapping around James. He screamed as his body was dragged downward, darkness consuming him, swallowing him into the abyss. The next morning, the villagers of Ravenwood found James's camera lying at the forest's edge. The photos inside captured his final moments. Darkness closing in, those glowing red eyes piercing through the night. No one ever saw James again. But from that night on, every full moon, a whisper carried through the wind, a desperate voice begging to be freed from the depths of hell. They say Ravenwood no longer has just one demon. Now it has two. Story 6. The Curse of Ravenmoor. Ravenmoor Cemetery had stood for centuries, forgotten by time and shrouded in whispers of darkness. The villagers knew better than to step foot inside once the sun had set, for those who did were never seen again. Towering above the graveyard on a jagged cliff was an abandoned castle, its spires reaching toward the full moon as if clawing at the heavens. Legends spoke of something buried beneath the cemetery, something that should never be disturbed. Michael Hargrove was not a man who believed in legends. As an investigative journalist specializing in uncovering myths, he had heard about the supposed curse of Ravenmoor. Tales of people vanishing, of eerie lights flickering within the graves, of whispers carried on the wind. It was all nonsense, he thought, but nonsense made for good stories. And so, on the night of the full moon, Michael set out to uncover the truth. The rusted cemetery gates groaned in protest as he pushed them open. Cold air swept through, sending chills down his spine. The place was deathly silent, save for the occasional rustle of dead leaves. Tombstones stood like jagged teeth, their inscriptions worn away by time. At the center of the graveyard stood an enormous mausoleum, its door slightly ajar, inviting yet foreboding. A wooden sign, half buried in the dirt, bore a warning: "Do not wake him." Michael smirked. Superstitions. He raised his camera and snapped a few pictures before stepping forward. But as he moved past the largest tombstone, a deep tremor vibrated through the ground. He froze. The earth beneath his feet shifted, the air suddenly thick with the scent of decay. Then came the sound, a crackling, splintering noise, as if bones were snapping and sinew was being stretched. Michael turned just in time to see a skeletal hand, massive and clawed, burst through the dirt. His breath hitched. The fingers twitched, flexed, then slammed into the earth, pulling something up from the depths. A figure emerged. Its skull gleamed under the moonlight, hollow sockets burning with red embers. Its skin, if it had any, was long gone, leaving behind sinew-wrapped bones that pulsed as if alive. A ragged, tattered cloak hung from its massive frame, draped like a funeral shroud. Behind it, rising from their graves, were creatures that defied explanation. Winged horrors with elongated faces, eyeless but seeing, their mouths stretched into eternal screams. Michael stumbled backward, his mind refusing to comprehend what he was witnessing. The skeletal entity took a step forward, its footfalls making the ground tremble. Then it spoke. A guttural voice, ancient and layered with the echoes of thousands of souls. "You have awakened me." Michael turned and ran. Branches tore at his clothes as he sprinted through the graveyard, his breath ragged, heart pounding. Behind him, the unholy chorus of the dead grew louder. He reached the gates, but before he could push through, an unseen force slammed them shut. He clawed at them, desperate, but the iron bars burned his hands. The wind howled, and suddenly, he was lifted from the ground by an invisible grip. He was thrown backward, landing in the dirt before the mausoleum. The massive figure loomed over him, those burning eyes drilling into his soul. "You will join me." Michael screamed as shadowy tendrils erupted from the creature's chest, latching onto his limbs, pulling him toward the gaping maw of the grave from which it had risen. His body contorted, twisted in ways unnatural, his skin splitting open as the darkness consumed him. His screams became distorted, blending into the thousands of voices already trapped within the creature. By morning, the cemetery was silent once more. The only sign of Michael's presence was his camera, lying in the dirt, its screen cracked but still displaying the last image taken. A picture of something rising from the grave, its hollow eyes burning, its skeletal hand reaching for the lens. And from that night forward, the villagers of Ravenmoor spoke of something new in the cemetery. A voice carried on the wind, whispering for release. A shadow standing at the gates, waiting. Michael had become part of the legend, and he was not alone. Story 7. The Dark Rider. The sun had long vanished beyond the horizon, leaving the land shrouded in perpetual darkness. The villagers of Raven's Hollow knew better than to venture out once the night fell. They whispered among themselves about the Dark Rider, an entity neither man nor beast, clad in flowing black robes, astride a ghostly white steed. Legends told that he was once a knight who had betrayed his kingdom, cursed to roam the lands for eternity, hunting the souls of those who dared cross his path. None who had heard the sound of his hooves survived to tell the tale. His presence was heralded by the distant echo of galloping, creeping closer with each breath until the unfortunate soul could do nothing but accept their grim fate. Jonathan Hale, a renowned bounty hunter, scoffed at these stories. He was a man of steel and reason, unshaken by myths spun by fearful peasants. When the nobles of Eldoria offered a handsome reward to anyone who could banish the rider, Jonathan took the job without hesitation. It was just another story, he assured himself. another ghost tale meant to keep the weak in check. Armed with a silver sword and a flask of holy water, he set out toward Shadowmere, the forsaken woodland said to be the rider's hunting ground. The air was thick with mist, curling around the ancient trees like spectral fingers. The silence was unnerving. No birds, no insects, just an overwhelming stillness that made Jonathan's instincts prickle. Then, it came. A single hoofbeat in the distance. At first, it was faint, almost imagined. But then another followed, and another. The rhythm built, like the drum of an approaching storm. The ground trembled beneath his feet. Jonathan gripped his sword tighter, his breath coming in short bursts. Through the fog, he saw it, an ethereal figure towering on horseback. The rider was clad in tattered black robes that flowed unnaturally, as though caught in a wind that did not exist. His face, or rather the void where his face should have been, was concealed beneath a hood. Two burning hollow sockets peered from beneath the shadowed cowl, their crimson glow piercing the darkness. The steed beneath him was skeletal, yet somehow alive, its nostrils expelling mist, hooves striking the earth with an unnatural force. The rider spoke, though his voice did not come from his mouth. It slithered into Jonathan's mind, slithering like oil through his thoughts. "You should not have come." Jonathan's muscles screamed for him to run, but his pride held him still. He raised his sword, steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "I don't fear you," he growled. The rider let out a sound, something between a chuckle and a sigh. It was the sound of rusted chains dragging across a tombstone, the breath of something ancient and long since forgotten. "Then you are a fool." With a flick of his wrist, the rider unsheathed his own weapon. A blade as black as the abyss, its edges shimmering with a spectral glow. The very air around it distorted, as though reality itself recoiled from its presence. Jonathan lunged. Their swords clashed, sending a shockwave through the trees. The force knocked Jonathan back, his boots skidding across the damp ground. The rider did not move. He merely watched, waiting. Jonathan attacked again, faster, stronger. He was a veteran in combat, his strikes swift and deadly. Yet every swing of his sword passed through nothing but shadows. The rider was there, and yet he was not. He was something beyond mortal comprehension, a nightmare given form. Then, without warning, the rider struck. A single cut, faster than the blink of an eye. Jonathan staggered, gasping. He looked down, expecting to see his body unscathed. Instead, he saw something far worse. His shadow was bleeding. Thick, black ichor oozed from the dark reflection at his feet, pooling around him. Panic seized him as he felt a cold, unrelenting force creep up his spine. His limbs grew heavy, his breath ragged. The darkness coiled around his body, dragging him downward. "You are mine now." The rider loomed over him, watching as Jonathan's body dissolved into the black abyss beneath him. His screams were swallowed by the void, his existence erased from the fabric of the world. By morning, the village of Raven's Hollow was silent. No one spoke of Jonathan Hale. His name was forgotten, as though he had never existed at all. But the next night, when the fog rolled in and the hoofbeats began once more, there was something different. Two riders now galloped through the mist. Story 8. The Curse of Ravenmoor. Ravenmoor Cemetery had stood for centuries, forgotten by time and shrouded in whispers of darkness. The villagers knew better than to step foot inside once the sun had set, for those who did were never seen again. Towering above the graveyard on a jagged cliff was an abandoned castle, its spires reaching toward the full moon as if clawing at the heavens. Legends spoke of something buried beneath the cemetery, something that should never be disturbed. Michael Hargrove was not a man who believed in legends. As an investigative journalist specializing in uncovering myths, he had heard about the supposed curse of Ravenmoor. Tales of people vanishing, of eerie lights flickering within the graves, of whispers carried on the wind. It was all nonsense, he thought, but nonsense made for good stories. And so, on the night of the full moon, Michael set out to uncover the truth. The rusted cemetery gates groaned in protest as he pushed them open. Cold air swept through, sending chills down his spine. The place was deathly silent, save for the occasional rustle of dead leaves. Tombstones stood like jagged teeth, their inscriptions worn away by time. At the center of the graveyard stood an enormous mausoleum, its door slightly ajar, inviting yet foreboding. A wooden sign, half buried in the dirt, bore a warning: "Do not wake him." Michael smirked. Superstitions. He raised his camera and snapped a few pictures before stepping forward. But as he moved past the largest tombstone, a deep tremor vibrated through the ground. He froze. The earth beneath his feet shifted, the air suddenly thick with the scent of decay. Then came the sound, a crackling, splintering noise, as if bones were snapping and sinew was being stretched. Michael turned just in time to see a skeletal hand, massive and clawed, burst through the dirt. His breath hitched. The fingers twitched, flexed, then slammed into the earth, pulling something up from the depths. A figure emerged. Its skull gleamed under the moonlight, hollow sockets burning with red embers. Its skin, if it had any, was long gone, leaving behind sinew-wrapped bones that pulsed as if alive. A ragged, tattered cloak hung from its massive frame, draped like a funeral shroud. Behind it, rising from their graves, were creatures that defied explanation. Winged horrors with elongated faces, eyeless but seeing, their mouths stretched into eternal screams. Michael stumbled backward, his mind refusing to comprehend what he was witnessing. The skeletal entity took a step forward, its footfalls making the ground tremble. Then it spoke. A guttural voice, ancient and layered with the echoes of thousands of souls. "You have awakened me." Michael turned and ran. Branches tore at his clothes as he sprinted through the graveyard, his breath ragged, heart pounding. Behind him, the unholy chorus of the dead grew louder. He reached the gates, but before he could push through, an unseen force slammed them shut. He clawed at them, desperate, but the iron bars burned his hands. The wind howled, and suddenly, he was lifted from the ground by an invisible grip. He was thrown backward, landing in the dirt before the mausoleum. The massive figure loomed over him, those burning eyes drilling into his soul. "You will join me." Michael screamed as shadowy tendrils erupted from the creature's chest, latching onto his limbs, pulling him toward the gaping maw of the grave from which it had risen. His body contorted, twisted in ways unnatural, his skin splitting open as the darkness consumed him. His screams became distorted, blending into the thousands of voices already trapped within the creature. By morning, the cemetery was silent once more. The only sign of Michael's presence was his camera, lying in the dirt, its screen cracked, but still displaying the last image taken. A picture of something rising from the grave, its hollow eyes burning, its skeletal hand reaching for the lens. And from that night forward, the villagers of Ravenmoor spoke of something new in the cemetery. A voice carried on the wind, whispering for release. A shadow standing at the gates, waiting. Michael had become part of the legend, and he was not alone. Story 9. The Black Riders of Ravenmoor. The village of Ravenmoor had always been shrouded in mystery, its name whispered with unease by those who lived in neighboring towns. An eerie fog clung to its outskirts, creeping along the cobbled streets as if searching for something long lost. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of the Black Riders, hooded figures who emerged from the mist on nights of the full moon. No one knew their true nature, but one thing was certain. Wherever they rode, death followed. For centuries, the people of Ravenmoor had lived in silent fear, never stepping outside their homes once night fell. It was said that anyone caught in the open when the riders came would vanish without a trace, their souls claimed by the spectral horsemen. The last sight any unfortunate victim saw was the gleam of a wickedly curved scythe, reflecting the silver light of the moon. William Carter was not a man who believed in myths. A journalist from Chicago, he had built a career on exposing folklore as nothing more than fear-driven superstition. When he received an anonymous letter detailing the legend of the Black Riders, he saw an opportunity for a great story. Armed with his camera, a flashlight, and a notebook, he set off for Ravenmoor, eager to prove that the so-called harbingers of doom were nothing more than an old wives' tale. The villagers were less than welcoming. They warned him not to stay past sundown, but William was undeterred. He made his way toward the old cemetery, the supposed epicenter of the legend, just as the last rays of daylight faded beyond the hills. The mist thickened, swirling at his feet like living tendrils. A biting chill swept through the air, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats. Faint at first, like a distant drumbeat, but growing louder with each passing second. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble. William swallowed hard, gripping his flashlight tighter. The villagers' warning suddenly didn't seem so ridiculous. From the mist, 4 towering figures emerged. Clad in flowing black robes, their faces obscured beneath deep hoods, they sat atop massive skeletal horses whose breath came in ragged, icy puffs. Each rider carried a weapon. One bore a scythe, another a rusted sword, the third a staff adorned with skulls, and the last wielded an axe stained with something far too dark to be rust. William took a step back, his breath caught in his throat. He forced himself to raise his camera, but before he could take a picture, one of the riders lifted a bony hand. "You should not have come." The voice was a rasping whisper, like wind howling through a crypt. William's body turned to ice. He tried to move, to run, but his feet refused to obey. The air grew heavy, pressing against his chest like an invisible force. The rider with the scythe dismounted, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps. The fog thickened around them, swallowing the cemetery whole. William tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The rider reached out, and the moment his skeletal fingers grazed William's forehead, his vision blurred. 1,000 voices screamed in his mind. He saw flashes of people, men, women, children, being dragged into the mist, their faces contorted in terror. He felt their agony, their despair. Their souls had been taken, their bodies erased from history, leaving behind only empty houses and unanswered questions. He realized, too late, that the riders were not mere legends. They were collectors. William felt himself being pulled, his very essence unraveling like threads of mist. His camera fell to the ground, forgotten. The riders surrounded him now, their weapons raised, their hollow eyes burning with an ancient hunger. His screams joined the chorus of the lost as the darkness consumed him whole. By morning, there was no trace of William Carter. The villagers found his abandoned car by the roadside, his belongings untouched. But they did not search for him. They knew there was nothing left to find. And on the next full moon, when the mist rolled in and the hoofbeats echoed once more, the riders were not 4. Now they were 5. Story 10. The Curse of the Watcher. The village of Blackmoor had long been abandoned, left to the ravages of time and the whispers of those too afraid to step near its ruined remains. Legends spoke of a curse that befell the land, an ancient guardian who watched over the ruins, waiting for the foolish and the damned. They called him the Watcher, a hooded figure with lifeless eyes, clad in decayed robes inscribed with runes older than civilization itself. No one who ventured into his domain ever returned. Daniel Whitmore was a man of logic, a professor of archaeology who scoffed at folklore and superstition. When he received word of an ancient tome hidden within the ruins of Blackmoor, he dismissed the villagers' warnings as baseless fear. He believed history was written by the brave, not the fearful. And so, on the eve of a full moon, he set out alone to uncover the truth. The night air was thick with moisture, the remnants of a storm lingering in the sky. The moon, full and ominous, cast long shadows through the skeletal remains of trees that bordered the cursed land. Daniel stepped carefully over cracked stone pathways, his flashlight flickering in the unnatural gloom. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, a stagnant reminder of death that had long claimed this place. At the heart of the ruins stood the remains of an ancient cathedral, its stone walls blackened and broken. A massive doorway, inscribed with symbols he couldn't decipher, loomed before him. The villagers had spoken of this place in hushed whispers, calling it the Threshold, the place where the Watcher dwelled. Daniel hesitated, but his resolve held firm. He stepped inside. The interior was suffocatingly silent. The air was thick, the dust unmoving as if frozen in time. Broken pews lined the massive chamber, their wooden frames warped and splintered. At the far end stood the altar, and behind it, he saw him. The Watcher. He was not a statue, though he stood as still as one. A figure draped in rotting black robes, inscribed with swirling symbols that pulsed as if alive. His face was obscured beneath a heavy hood, but his eyes were open. Two empty voids, glowing with a dull, eerie light, fixed directly upon Daniel. A sudden weight crushed the air from his lungs. The room darkened, the walls seeming to stretch, twist, as if the space around him had become something else. Something sentient. A voice, deep and guttural, not spoken but embedded directly into his mind, resonated through the chamber. You have come to claim knowledge that is not yours to take. Daniel staggered back, his legs suddenly leaden. The Watcher moved, but not as a man would. He glided, silent, unnatural, as though the ground itself carried him forward. The air grew cold, and Daniel felt something else. Something inside him begin to shift. His reflection in the cracked glass of a nearby window showed the horror unfolding. His skin darkened, veins rising like ink through parchment. The symbols on the Watcher's robes began to etch themselves into his flesh. He screamed, clawing at his arms, his face, but the transformation was irreversible. His memories fractured, splintering like broken glass. He saw visions of those before him, others who had come seeking knowledge, others who had been claimed. Their screams echoed in his skull, merging with his own until he could no longer tell where his voice ended and theirs began. The cathedral walls pulsed. The Watcher loomed over him, and for the first time, Daniel understood the truth. There was never just one Watcher. Each soul taken became the next. The last bearer of the curse would always be replaced by the next fool who ventured too far. His body was no longer his own. As the first light of dawn touched the ruins of Blackmoor, the villagers who dared look from afar saw no sign of Daniel Whitmore. But there was something different. The Watcher still stood within the ruins. But now, his eyes were Daniel's, and he was waiting.